And now it's time for the first speaker, our keynote speaker, Lorena Mesa, who actually one of these people who came outside of Sweden for our conference. She's from Chicago, and she's a software engineer at GitHub. And she's also very active in the community and working with Python Foundation. So let us welcome her. Where is she?
Okay, can you hear me all right? Awesome. Now the really fun, awkward part of switching computers and looking like you know what you're doing. Okay.
She knows what she's doing. She did it so many times. She actually told me the crazy story how she fell down from the stage.
EuroPython, I almost fell off stage.
So if she will do like this, like a rock star, please take her like that and hold from the public.
Wow, I'll be kind of like...
That will be awesome. You know, they filmed this.
That'd be really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. We're plugged and we're waiting for some sync. Sync. Work for me. Let's do one more time. This worked a moment ago. Dun, 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 dun. No. Interesting. This was working a moment ago. Oh, what did you do? Oh, brilliant. Okay. See, things I don't know. So fun. Okay, and let me, okay, because we went to sleep. Of course. Just a moment, y'all. Thanks for being patient.
I can tell some information about lunch. I forgot about this. Food is also important. So the ones who have a special cost, you will go downstairs with your tickets that you get during the registration. The ones who has no food preferences or allergies, you can choose where you would like to have lunch. They will serve around 60 people here upstairs, or you can go downstairs to the restaurant. As I understand, the manager of their building told that they're holding 2 events at the same time. That's why they think that restaurant downstairs would be too crowded. That's why they divided us into groups. Så passa på och mingla. So, thank you.
Okay, now there's something on the screen. Awesome. Let me just make sure I can toggle, which would be good. Okay, brilliant. All right. Thank you so much for being here today, this morning. 1, very early, and 2, we're going to get into a heavy topic. So great way to start the day. As a disclaimer, I do actually always make my slides available. So if you do want to reference this, there's a lot of content. All the content links back to the resources. And if there is something that is not linked for some reason, please do let me know. I will make sure to go and update that after the fact. But that is actually the bit.ly link you can use for that. I will also share on social media. But that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. So the start of this chat is titled, Now is Better Than Never, What the Zen of Python Can Teach Us About Data Ethics. So yeah, as you heard, my name is Lorena Mesa, and really the big thing about why I like to talk about this is I pretty much think that this is something that is very, very important for us, not only as technologists, but also as technology users to think about. And I'm really hoping that this chat is going to give us a framework for us to kind of have some of these dialogues, not only with one another, but with the people that we're creating tech for. If you do have any questions after the fact, I am on most corners of the internet as Lorena Nicole, and yes, that is 4 O's. I don't know, that's what stuck, and I think that's where it's at, but I am on most corners of the internet with that handle. So a little bit about kind of how I approach my work. I do a fair amount in Chicago with PyLady Chicago, founder and organizer with that. Django Girls, I think probably I think there's been a few Django girls around the Scandinavian region, but actually I do a lot of things in the open source community where I'm having a lot of dialogues with people who, as technologists, they may not be classically trained in computer science, and that actually does inform very much how I approach this topic. So, big question. Why should we care about data ethics? That is a very, very frequent question that I get, and I like to say that's a very good question. So when we're thinking about data ethics, should we care about it because of just the sheer number of records or just the volume of data that we're generating daily? This is actually an interesting stat. So I actually had used a stat that was from 2012 from BBC, which actually said that we had 2.5 gigabytes of new data that was generated daily. So when I went to go update this with March 2018 from a Bloomberg article, it's interesting just to see the scale at which we're producing data. So should we care about data ethics just because the sheer volume where we're now at 2.5 quintillion records of new data that's created daily? That's perhaps one argument. The other thing we can think about, it's not just the sheer volume of data that we are creating, but it's also the ways in which we are actually generating that data. So when we think about data collection, we can think about it broadly speaking as two categories. We have an active kind of category. For example, if you think maybe about traditional social sciences, you might think of a survey, or if you've ever used a product, or like I was just in Oslo and I got a follow-up email from my hotel that's like, hey, how was your experience? So that would be an active example of data collection where you as a subject are actually informed and consenting to the collection of data. Well, what's been interesting with the technical era, and I think as all of us in here know, it has been the expansion of passive data collection processes. That is, you may not actually be aware of how that works. So things we can think about web tracking technologies like cookies. We can think about things like GPS. We can think about things like chatbots. So for example, there's an increasing space where, for example, if you use social media, maybe you buy from a vendor, like if you participate and buy something on Etsy, which for those of you who may not know what Etsy is, it's basically a bunch of different artisans who have shops and they sell their wares online. Sometimes they tie it into a Facebook profile, and if you're like, where is my thing that I ordered, you might have a chatbot that you're interacting with, and it may be collecting data to help kind of sort where that conversation should go. So that's an example of a passive data collection process. We also have things like social media monitoring, listening. We have other passive measurements like a Fitbit, which is something I do actually wear a lot. And I'm curious if anyone heard about that infographic, or rather a graphic that was floating around the internet where in the US, members of the military, they wear Fitbits, and you were actually able, based on the foot traffic of people that are in the military, you could actually see where US military bases were. So again, passive measurements, right? The Fitbit, we might understand for personal health, but it can actually be intended for other things. And the idea of passive data collection goes on and go on. So we can say maybe we should care about data collection not only because of how much data we're collecting, but how we're generating it and how that relates to consent and what it is we're then doing with those data sets. Which then leads me to this kind of last bit, which is it's not only that we're collecting data in such sheer volumes that we've never seen before in new and arguably disturbing ways, but it's also then how it has impact on the social world around us. So thinking about perhaps how people getting online today. I can remember a day when I had dial-up internet, and I remember I was always on the home line, and my abuela, my grandmother, would always be like, why are you on the internet? But I can remember a day when the internet was a commodity, it was rare, it was something that we weren't so socialized to, but today, young people are increasingly getting online earlier and earlier. So the kind of reference here is that data that we're collecting, it's also about a broader and a bigger age population, and also that data that we use actually informs how we interact with each other socially. So what this article is referencing is kind of behaviors of cyberbullying and the disparity that exists between young people and their parents, where parents actually aren't understanding how much time young people are spending online or what that experience looks like. So at the end of the day, when we talk about why we should care about data ethics, my answer to you is as simple as this. The internet is creating everything in the world around us. It's redefining our social relationships in ways that we are continuously redefining and re-understanding. I cannot even begin to imagine 10 years ago that I would have friends that I do not meet until I arrive at an event like PyCon Sweden, and I'm like, oh, hey, we're Twitter friends, and I'm walking around like looking for their ambiguous Twitter photo in a sea of people. So when it comes to data ethics, really the data that we use, that we consume, it has a intrinsic social component, and we need to be thinking critically about this. So some notes on how we're going to approach today's chat. One thing that I really do want to proffer here is that this is not the answer. It is not even an answer that's going to work across all solutions, but rather this is meant to be a dialogue. This is meant for us to have critical thinking. This is meant to allow us ways that we can approach these conversations so that when we as technologists are talking with one another, when we as technology users are thinking about how we interact with tools, what our expectations of those tools are, we've got a place that we can start and we have a roadmap perhaps to follow. Another thing to be said, I will be going into some examples that may be a little sensitive. So I always like to be mindful to anyone that if the content's a little too heavy for you, I will not be offended if you want to take a step outside, or if maybe you're just not feeling that content right now. So I will not be offended if anyone feels they want to opt out of that, but it is something that I will be going into some sensitive topics. And lastly, really what this conversation is meant to be is allow us to think about the question, how can we move the needle in the right direction? So let's go ahead and get into it. And I apologize. I know that font is a little small, but that's okay. It's the Zen of Python. I don't expect us to all think that this is something new or groundbreaking. So Lorena, in your talk title, you mentioned the Zen of Python. Like, what does this actually have to do with data ethics? Well, the thing that I really love about the Zen of Python is this is perhaps arguably the first thing, or one of the first things that you're introduced to when you're like, what is Python? What is this thing that I can work with? And you probably go into a Python shell, a REPL shell, and you do import this, and you get this kind of interesting, I don't know, philosophical set of instructions of what is the Zen of Python. So the Zen of Python was introduced in 2004 with the Python Enhancement Proposal number 20. And when we start getting into what is the Zen of Python, it's a really interesting and beloved thing in our community, written by Tim Peters. And I thought it was a really interesting way to perhaps allow us to kind of think about data ethics. Namely, so if we were looking at, so Kenneth Reitz, the author of such beloved libraries as Requests, and also of such documents and publications like Hitchhiker's Guide to Python, something that's interesting about how he kind of talks about the Zen of Python is specifically, as shown here, is how when we talk about what it means to write good Pythonic code, or what makes good Pythonic code, is that this is something that can be kind of highly subjective, and it kind of depends on context. So again, this idea of the Zen of Python, when we're looking at some of the things that are outlined here, such as beautiful is better than ugly, explicit is better than implicit, all these are meant to be aphorisms and meant to be dialogues that we have with one another, and is not meant to be an absolutist contract, which I thought was kind of a cool way that we can maybe apply it to data ethics. So for this reason, I kind of am tapping a little into the Zen of Python to help us to think about, like, what is data ethics and how can we have these dialogues? So let's go ahead and get into it. Complex is better than complicated. Where did this data ethics thing come from? So when we think about ethics, and I imagine ethics, because they can have a highly variable and highly different definition depending on what profession you're in, depending on what your training is, I think it can inspire a lot of thoughts, such as, is it the language of right or wrong? Is it our rights and responsibilities, or is it perhaps something else? Well, the way that I want us to think about data ethics is I really like this framework that's provided to us from an article in Philosophical Transactions, which actually gives us this three-pronged approach. The ethics of data, that is, how is data generated, recorded, and shared? The ethics of algorithms, that is, how AI, machine learning, how robots are interpreting data. And then lastly, the ethics of practice. That is, how are we devising responsible innovation and professional codes to guide this emerging science? So as we're going through our examples, I inspire you to think about it from this kind of macro perspective, because this is really going to allow you to actually walk away with context that's relevant to the work that you do, to the tech that you put out into the world. And I think this demonstrates just the complexity of this conversation. So ethics of data, ethics of algorithms, ethics of practice. So to give a classic example, if I'm talking about perhaps the ethics of data, if I were to say, okay, I'm writing software that's going to do some kind of financial forecasting. Maybe I'm writing a machine learning model that's going to do some forecasting for a specific type of stock. If I need to provide some data of how that model comes into the world, maybe the data that I'm working with is the opening and closing stock price points from Dow Jones or from whatever market I'm looking at. That data that I provide, it gives us an idea of a ground truth, some kind of imperial notion that is representing the world around us. So that data then becomes the active component, the active thing that represents truthhood. So when we're thinking about the idea of ethics of data, we need to be a little bit mindful of thinking about what is it that data is doing for us and how we're consuming it. I thought this was really interesting. This is actually from my Twitter profile. You can actually go in Twitter settings, see the data that's collected about you and how Twitter understands who you are as a person that uses their software. Notice anything interesting here? Specifically this bit in the middle with age. I have no idea how I'm understood to be 13 to 54 and or greater than 65. I'm not sure what my persona is like, where I'm all ages, but not 55 to 64. So not to put too fine of a point on it, and we're not going to be spending time deconstructing like how that came into the world, but this is kind of the thing that we're talking about when we talk about ethics of data and how that data is consumed. Data is very much an active thing. It provides truthhood. It provides a snapshot of the world around us. And that's where we need to be sitting and thinking critically about the software we put into the world, the technical tools that we create. A thinker, an academic who's pretty active in this space and who I highly recommend reading, she wrote what I believe to be the quintessential pop culture book on data science and its responsibilities or lack thereof in the current world, is Cathy O'Neil. Her publication's titled Weapons of Math Destruction. But I think she says it very nicely when she says, big data processes codify the past. That is, data is active. It is not a passive thing. It is literally creating it is making decisions. It is sorting information in the world around us. And part of the things we have to be critical of is thinking about how that data is creating privilege in the world around us and how that data may be actually causing problems also in the world around us. She goes on to say that as technologists, we really need to be thinking about explicitly embedding better values into our algorithms. Ultimately, that may mean putting fairness ahead of profit. Another way we can think about this comes from a publication in Television and New Media where you can say, if we're talking about the relationship between data to algorithms and then how algorithms inform the world around us, is quite literally that today algorithms are literally sorting the information around us and, quote unquote, doing the distribution of the sensible. So when we're talking about data ethics, this three-prong approach, ethics of data, ethics of algorithms, ethics of practice, allows us to draw big insights and allow us to think very critically about how we are intersecting with this topic. So cool. How does that impact me? Well, let me tell you a little bit of a story about how I got started in tech. Back in 2008, I was bright-eyed, bushy-tail undergraduate, and I joined this campaign, this U.S. presidential campaign, which was the presidential campaign of Barack Obama. One of the things that I think is groundbreaking about that political campaign is the use of technology that was quite unprecedented at the time. Specifically, Arianna Huffington points it out, and I think says it and sums it up very well, where she says, were it not for the internet, Barack Obama would not be president. Were it not for the internet, Barack Obama would not have been the nominee. So some of the ways that you may have seen this, and if you aren't as familiar with the ins and outs of that campaign, there's some examples here that are provided. So for example, use of social media. Social media, 2008, this was a very avant-garde piece of technology, which is very interesting because today we take that for granted, right? But the way that we use social media was quite groundbreaking for a United States presidential campaign, or really even for a campaign period. So we were using YouTube to do what we call town halls, which is where you might meet your constituents and have dialogues with them in smaller spaces, and then get questions from the YouTube kind of comments. We also have what is GOTV, get out the vote drives that were informed by this new and fancy thing called data science, which ultimately led to the customized fill in the blank for Obama. Specifically, I was working on a team called the Latino Outreach team. So we were looking at 4 key states in the United States. We were looking at Colorado, New Mexico, Florida, and Arizona. And one of the things that's pretty interesting about even that group is the way that you position identity. You can say, I'm Latino, I'm Latina, I'm Hispanic, I'm Chicano, I'm Chicana, I'm Tejano. There's all of these things. So really that customization and the use of tech to customize that message, that was groundbreaking. What's even more interesting, and I'm sure this is a very familiar graphic now, but back in the day, about 10 years ago, we were doing data science before I even knew what data science was. We were kind of pulling all of these things from different places. We have folks, and as much as I kind of roll my eyes when I see this Venn diagram, because no one person is the unicorn in the middle, but data science really, it draws from disciplines, it draws from mathematics, it draws from stats, it draws from subject area expertise, and it draws from computer science. What was interesting is I was doing data science before there was even, I think, a term for data science in Wikipedia, which I believe is 2012. And, we didn't really understand what we were doing, or, you can have this dialogue and this argument with a bunch of people about talking about who is a data scientist. And I kind of put this up here for snark because data science is highly variable. The notion that a person who is better at stats than any software engineer and better at software engineering than any statistician, perhaps that's data science. I don't know. I'll leave it to you to decide it. But the thing that was really interesting is our use of social media was groundbreaking in that campaign. But one of the things we never paused to stop to think about is, should we be using it? Should this be a piece of technology that we go all in on? Some of the examples we're going to dig into, actually, we're going to start with social media. It's some of these questions where now, hindsight is 2020, right? We have lessons learned and lived, but how that fundamentally changed the way that politics is engaging with folks, at least within the United States, that's a lesson learned, and that is something that I think informs the way in which I look at how I am creating tech and putting it into the world. So special cases aren't special enough to break the rules. Case study 1, censorship and cyberbullying in social media. So I'm just going to kind of pause and allow these headlines to sit with you for a moment. So these are all headlines from like the last 18 months. And I think if there's any one common theme that you can see is social media is contentious, to put it lightly. So in digging into the reference about Rose Mcgowan, so in the Me Too moment, which if you're not familiar with that movement, it talks about basically issues around sexual assault, largely in the entertainment industry around Hollywood in the United States. So there was a lot of dialogue that popped up talking about what is sexual assault, how do we report it? All of these things were dialogues that were happening also on spaces like social media. So a Hollywood actress named Rose Mcgowan was a voice that early on in the hashtag #MeToo dialogue was someone that people were paying attention to. And what was interesting is then one day her account is no longer on Twitter. And people were very curious why. Why is this happening? Is it because she's talking about Me Too? Is her voice being censored? And what actually ensues then is the response from the Twitter safety team where they say, well, actually, we have terms of service and Rose Mcgowan violated them, specifically leaking potentially personal information, and it's for that reason that this person is censored. So when we think about censorship in social media, this could be an example of that. But yet, let's compare it with this. So I am not trying to proffer any political ideology here, but what I'm trying to proffer instead is the question of who is censored and how. What does it mean to censor in social media? And what does it mean for us as technologists to think about that? So something that I think that is a theme that has started to emerge is this notion that when we start creating software and we automate decisions, what we notice is that automation is for the masses, but it's the privileged few who get that fine human touch. And with social media, we see this time and time again. So when we talk about social media works quite differently across all platforms. We can say with Wikipedia, and yes, I would argue that there is a social component to Wikipedia because if you're actually putting an article onto Wikipedia, there is actually dialogue that happens back and forth when you're editing a page. So there is a good corpus, a good data set called the Detox Project, which actually scrapes a bunch of this. And what's interesting about that data set is they were actually there's a lot of demographic information associated with people who are authors for articles. So when we talk about social media and maybe you're like, I want to create some kind of mechanism to do censorship or to deter cyberbullying, when we're talking about social media across platforms, this is a highly variable and different thing. With Reddit, we have highly autonomous communities that can be self-regulated, so we may not understand who the actual individuals and entities are. With Wikipedia, there is actually information that's required to register and to be a trusted author, so you have more information there. And then we have things like Twitter, which is public, but may not require actual real information. And then also on Twitter, we've got the character limit, which has been doubled, but all of these things is just to kind of demonstrate that social media does work quite different across all platforms. So kind of putting censorship to the side and thinking a little bit about another or a common dialogue that's happening around social media and some of the problems of it falls under what we call cyberbullying. So if we're thinking about cyberbullying, one of the ways that you can define what cyberbullying is by saying that you have deliberate, repeated, and hostile behavior by an individual or group with the intent to harm. So when we're talking about cyberbullying, that's maybe something I can write software for. I can look for instances of repetition. I can maybe do some natural language processing to try to understand what sentiment is. So cyberbullying, maybe that is something, if I'm thinking about cyberbullying, about maybe there is a question that I can write software for to understand this. So some of the ways we can think about if I want to write software that is going to end goal reduce cyberbullying or at least do cyberbullying detection on social media, there's a few ways I can organize this question. And this is to say that perhaps I want to identify the offender, that is the person a troll? Or perhaps I want to identify instances of cyberbullying. That is this conversation problematic? Or is there aggression in this conversation? Or maybe there's a threshold where we say, the likelihood that this thing is aggressive is this %. So maybe we have a threshold kind of way. So this is obviously a complicated problem to solve. And some of the ways that this has been done in social media historically is through content moderation via the product owner or content moderation via user feedback. So the notion that you have the little click where it's hey, I don't want to see this piece of content, and then you're able to go and categorize it, right? That's kind of maybe the example that we're used to. Or if you're in Reddit, the community actually has its own, some communities have their own arbitration mechanism that they can enforce. So let's go into Facebook then as an example. So Facebook's been kind of at the forefront of some of the dialogue around this. So just looking at sheer numbers alone with Facebook and talking about this problem, at the time that this article came out from The Guardian in May 2017, there was about 7,500 content moderators with more than 1 billion posts a day, with more than 10 million posts flagged daily as being potentially aggressive, spammy, something that's not good, that shouldn't be on the platform. And some of the ways then that Facebook went in to start thinking about how to deter, how to combat these kind of issues was by then starting to say, okay, well, we've got rules of moderation that can help us understand protected classes. So when we talk about protected classes, there's this explicit categories that are protected, which include things like race, but there are non-protected classes like things that are age. So that's kind of interesting. So one of the things that kind of came out that was problematic around this is when content moderators were actually being trained to say, this piece of content is problematic, this piece of content is not. Specifically as it relates to this idea of protected categories. So protected categories, just to enumerate what these are, include things like sex, race, religious affiliation, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, and serious disability or disease. So an example that was used, if you see on the right-hand side, this is actually from training material that content moderators were exposed to, which is, is content that says, for example, all white men are bad, is that good or bad? That would be deemed as problematic content because you're talking about white and you're talking about men, so gender and race are protected classes, so ergo that we're going to moderate that. But if you say something like all black children are bad, when you start combining these rules together, that's where they say, okay, well, we have a protected class, which is black, but we have an unprotected class, which is age. So the age is the non-protected class. It modifies the protected class. Ergo, we will not moderate that piece of content, and it will continue to exist on the platform. So these are rules that are invented on the fly, and these are rules that like if there's a problem, maybe enough people will start calling it out. And actually, recently there was a series done by Vice Motherboard where some of these rules have now started to change, but it was only because of public scorn and a lot of attention in the news that really these things started to shift. And so if there's one layer of problems, which is how do we write algorithms to even deal with the sheer volume, if there's another thing about then what are these content moderation rules and how do we build these things, then the other thing too is who are the actual content moderators themselves. So this actually, there's been a lot of coverage talking about, what is the mental health impact for people who are literally going through how many pieces of content daily where you have no context of what's coming next across your screen. Another thing too is, are these people actually considered full-time employees? Because for a period of time, Facebook had content moderators who were not full-time employees, so they didn't get the same benefits and perks, perhaps with health insurance, and some of those benefits as, say, maybe a full-time employee, recognized employee of Facebook. So there's just layer upon layer upon layer of problems here. And this is just where I kind of have to sit to think about, when no one human can actually go through and sift through all this conversation, through all social media, through online communications, when we don't have enough humans to intervene, what do we risk? So back to that idea of automation for the masses, the privileged few having that human personal touch. Errors should never pass silently. Case study 2, predictive policing. So I'm going to get into my hometown, Chicago. So if you've ever looked at anything about Chicago, or if you've heard a little bit about Chicago, you might hear things like Windy City, which is not a reference to how windy it is, but is actually a throwback to the era of gangsters, 1920s, Al Capone, and kind of hot air, aka wind, the corruption running amok in Chicago. So Chicago is kind of considered a quintessential example of a segregated city, not segregated in the context where we have legal laws that say this space is for this kind of person and this space is for that kind of person, but quite literally where we have a city that if you actually look at where folks live based on ethnicity, social class, things like that, the Northwest side is largely white, it is largely affluent, and that is very different than the Southwest side and the South side, which is largely where you have your communities of color and where there's a dearth of resources. So you can even look at maps with public transportation and infrastructure and see this disparity. So when we talk about some of the disparity with resources as well, one of them is police. So in 2017, our mayor, Rahm Emanuel, started talking about, well, we've got a policing problem. We need to start thinking about this. What should we do? And his thought was, let's not invest in more human cops, but let's start doing software. Let's do some predictive policing. And we started very quickly getting into dialogues that felt very, very Minority Report, not to try to reference a Tom Cruise movie, but it started to feel very much like that. To put into more context, what is some of these software solutions that were coming out? One of the things that was being kind of kicked around is let's have the idea of delivering a risk score. So let's say a Chicago Police Department officer pulls someone over for some infraction. Maybe they're driving, maybe a taillight's out. I don't know. But the idea was you would have this risk score of 1 to 500 that would be generated and could be an additional data point used by a police officer to help them determine how they're going to respond to the person they're pulling over. What's the problem with that? Well, it's a black box model, and there's not any information around how did this score get derived? Why is this supposed to be a score that's provided in a situation where you're having to make decisions like that, where it's very quick? These kind of things are not going to be very beneficial, and also these kind of strategies were being explicitly targeted in areas that have been historically communities of color and where there's been other economic disparities. So to bring it even further then, this is the kind of stuff that's happening in Chicago right now. So in November 2014, there was a big reveal about a dash cam showing a young black man who was shot 13 times. 13 times. And the big thing that was the fallout from that was, is this police officer going to be brought to trial or not? So the police officer was actually found guilty not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder. And first-degree murder means that it's an intentional murder, it's premeditated with malice. Whereas second-degree murder is an intentional murder, but is not premeditated or planned in advance, because we have two categories for that. So this officer was actually found guilty of second-degree murder just this past October, and then there's a subsequent case which is talking about conspiracy. So when we talk about conspiracy, that is the intentional falsifying of police records to try to say or try to misrepresent what was happening. And if you can read that, maybe that's a little too small. December 7th, so this past Friday, this court case finished, and we are waiting to hear what's happening from that. So when we talk about public resources and software that's going to be arbitrating, automating these kind of decisions and solutions, this is also the social construct that's behind this that is happening right now. Other things to think about within Chicago, because again, really focusing on my hometown here, but other things too include, not only is it this kind of like predictive policing, these black box algorithms that are being kicked around as potential ways to police, but also what is the tech that people are using? So yes, we're back to social media monitoring and tracking. The ACLU brought lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department just this past summer for their use of social media monitoring and tracking tools. Within the brief, they go in and they talk about such providers in their marketing material saying, oh, hey, you can monitor such hashtags as Black Lives Matter or police brutality or it's time for change. So they're actually using in their marketing materials hashtags that may be associated with an activist kind of mentality or with a movement that is talking about brutality, that is talking about corruption, is trying to bring some of these things to the forefront. And so, yes, we do have tech that's being used also by lawmakers for other means than they were intended. The Amazon example, I think, is really interesting. So since we like to spell everything very interestingly as techies, it's recognition with a K, if you were to spell it in English, not the proper spelling. But then, it's not only that we are hyper-focused maybe in a locale where there's this kind of historical social distrust and issues with policing, but now we're also getting providers who are releasing software into the wilderness where they're saying, hey, we have face recognition software, you should use us. And our case study is written by a law enforcement officer, and they run through a demo of how to use it. This is super easy software to use, you should use it. The problem is actually then the case study, which was prominently featured on the website for a period of time, says, hey, use an 80% confidence level and use a data set that's mugshots, and you can very quickly start training to do facial recognition with new faces just by following along with this example. The problem then is the ACLU went and actually replicated this, and the ACLU, by the way, is kind of a watchguard that kind of sees when constitutional rights within the United States have been violated. They went and replicated this using mugshots as was recommended, and also using the United States congressional body as their faces to be identified, and they found there was a lot of bias in falsely labeling faces of color as potentially matching someone in their database. So going into this, we can even say, well, there's on the one side, the case study that's featured prominently on the website where it is arguably maybe not a technologist. They're not actually using the default settings that AWS or that Amazon recommends, which is one of the things Amazon said. They're like, oh, well, you should be using like a 95% confidence level, but yet their training says this is how you do it. So we can talk about, okay, well, how do you educate people how to use your software? We can talk about the problems with using a mugshot database, which may be skewed to overrepresent some people because of social inequities and social justice issues. And also there's even things with just like facial recognition software itself being problematic. So there's something called the one pixel attack, which can fool deep neural networks to incorrectly label or classify an image if you just change one pixel. So there's many ways you can kind of like combat this, or this CV Zazzle. No, that is not the hairstyle of tomorrow. Well, maybe, who knows? But what this art project kind of goes into is saying, okay, well, if you're training an algorithm to learn what a human face looks like, so the idea that maybe you're pulling your hair back if you're a woman and you have longer hair, just to kind of foul stereotypes, let's obscure the face with a kind of non-traditional haircut. Let's hide the face, and then maybe we can get past facial recognition. So even other strategies that are being used are themselves suspect to things, both from the education front, but also if you start talking about how you're actually implementing under the hood some of this, there are things that we need to be mindful of. What data are you providing to train on? What algorithms are you using? What are the limits of those algorithms? Are those algorithms black boxes? So, which then leads to just a quick detour into unless explicitly silenced. Case study 3, fake news. So this is kind of rife within the United States public imagination for many reasons, but some of the ways we can think about that is the use of bots on social media. So part of what this is kind of commenting on is 2 students from Berkeley, which is located in California, where they were kind of tracking a shooting that happened around Berkeley campus, where very quickly the story went from, hey, there's a shooting, to, hey, there's a shooting, and the possible people or the possible offenders that they're looking for are recent converts to Islam. And it's this small perversion, which wasn't unclear like where that came from, but how quickly that story changed, and how bots then can continue to, at an automated pace, pump that information out. It's no wonder that when we go and do some studies of news cycle shares, that we find that falsehoods spread much more quickly than truthhoods. So when we're talking about kind of news cycles and things like that in the public imagination and how we respond to things, being a person that's critically taking in the quality of that news and knowing like if that news itself is true, that itself can become an issue. Then what happens if you start getting into places where, okay, maybe within our countries we have the idea of a free press or the idea of a press that's separate from the government. Well, in some spaces that may not be possible. So Facebook, yet again, kind of coming to the forefront with coming under scrutiny when in some countries like Myanmar, where they, like the notion of like, how do you get news? Your source is Facebook, how are falsehoods spread on Facebook can be problematic and can even lead to violence. So specifically, there was issues with news being circled around that actually led to a minority ethnic group fleeing and being at potential human harm, fearing for their lives because of these kind of issues. I thought this was kind of interesting. I went to go look for a Chicago Tribune article this morning, and I like that the response was, oh, hey, yeah, there's like GDPR stuff. We'll take care of it later. So, if you literally don't, there's some countries where you literally may not have access to news resources. So when you do, what ensues as a result? So again, all this to say that algorithms as well as data are shaped and designed by humans. There is not this notion that our data is uncorruptible, that it is not this passive process. All of these things are things that we create, that we use, that we put into the world around us. And yes, we embed values and power structures into them. So now is better than never. What can we do to change the game? So the ethics of data, how can you better understand your data? Some interesting projects that are kind of floating around. So this comes from MIT Media Lab and is pretty interesting. So in the same way that you might look at a food product, on the back of that food product, it says, this is how many units of calories, or this is the % of my overall intake for like sodium or something like that. We have this idea, this design standard of how we understand human nutrition. Why can't we apply that to data? So this is kind of so one of the projects that I think is interesting is trying to understand data itself. How do we understand how that data was collected? How do we understand some of the biases in it? How can we generate labels that tap in some to those quantitative, qualitative measurements and just plunk it right onto a data set so we know, hey, should we be using this? Or, hey, if we are using this data set, it may need to be adjusted to offset some of the issues that we have with data quality. Another project that's kind of looking at this is the Facets Overview and Facets project, which you can go to pair-code.github.io. And this is a project that does a lot of visualization, kind of looking at some of the quantitative components, again, for data exploration. So it helps you with things like unexpected feature values, missing feature values, training and serving skew, and such components there. So if you're thinking about how do I better understand data, there's something to be said about being able to provide a language for how we can deconstruct what a data set is, and how we can use perhaps that data set, or even being able to say maybe we should not use that data set. So algorithms as well are shaped by and designed by humans. So if we're talking about how to do our algorithms better, what are ways we can do this? to put it succinctly, I think Deborah Hanaus said this pretty well with 4 key things: explore, understand your data, explore your errors, make your results interpretable, and if you don't know something, find someone who does. Human communication is good. So some of the ways we see this, that this has been involving, has been in what is called FAT or FATE algorithms, fair, accountable, transparent, and ethical algorithms. There are many spaces that are doing some work around this. So learning fair representations. Can we mathematically understand what it means to represent fairness in our algorithms? Or another way we can talk about it is, can we instead have different criteria to use the correctness or how a decision comes about to be made? So Berkeley AI kind of went through a financial instrument, a financial algorithm that determines, yes, we will extend a loan to someone versus no. Instead of it being reliant maybe only on a credit score, perhaps we can have a different threshold modifier or classifier to help us understand how we arrive at that decision. So for example, we can maybe say we want to have demographic parity, or maybe we want to have equality of opportunity. But these algorithms are trying to reconceptualize how it is we're arriving at decisions and using explicit values-driven kind of things to be baked into our algorithms. And then the ethics of practice. How can you make your practices more intentional and deliberate? So I think this might be something that has been well heard, but the notion of kind of like this Hippocratic oath for data practitioners, data consumers, this idea that if we were taking the Hippocratic oath from the medical industry and applying it to tech, what would that look like? There are many groups who are doing this kind of work, from ACM, their Committee on Professional Ethics. So for example, in October this past year, they have, on Twitter, they had a big dialogue around ethics in computing. There are such groups within the United States, like Data for Democracy, that are kind of coming up with templates for kind of what are the principles we should abide by. And if you're looking for more groups, because there are some that are more kind of localized, that focus on the EU versus perhaps other spaces, there is actually compiled lists out there. So one way we can do it is by collectively ourselves defining what our standards are to try to do better. But that is all to say that yes, an ethical code is a place to start, but it is by no means the ends at which we should stop, because at the end of the day, we do need ways to actually follow up with enforcement and such things, or as this kind of article saying, having skin in the game. So I think this is done well here, and I don't think I need to do as much dialogue around this. But again, you can start simply by saying, what is your data life cycle? Not just from inception, but also, the right to be forgotten, the right for deletion. So again, GDPR, back to Chicago Tribune. I like that it's just like, no, we're not there yet. So this is definitely one way you can start. Something that I think is interesting, we have a UK mathematician, Hannah Fry, who wrote in her book, Hello World, talking about perhaps we can have a clearinghouse for algorithms. Perhaps there's this third-party space where we can go ahead, check in our algorithms so that we've got other folks actually assessing them, actually deconstructing them, actually coming up with a way that we can review them. So the idea of an FDA, which stands for Food and Drug Administration, which is a department within the United States government, what would a clearinghouse like that look like? And something that's actually happening right now, another way to think about it is, it's not only an ethical code or talking about how your organization does things or creating your data life cycle, or even saying we need to have an institution or an actual enforcement arm, but we can actually just talk about it from education as well. So one of the ways that this is kind of popping up, so the Mozilla Foundation actually, and it closes tonight, there is actually a competition that's happening that's around responsible computer science. So if we're bringing ethics to undergraduate computer science education, or to education where we're teaching young people that may be technologists, what would that look like? So education is perhaps another place to do this. So that is all to bring us then to just kind of my last question, which is, I gave you a lot of examples of problems in the world around us. I gave us a framework in which we can use to kind of think about how we can break down some of these issues and understand potential threats or potential problems and complexities that exist within the technology we consume and the technology that we create. So I hope that I can leave you all with this question, which is, what is the impact you want to make as a technologist? And where are areas you can start bringing some of this to the work that you do? So I don't have the answer for everyone because it is highly variable based on the work that you do, but ideally there's some open source projects, there's some language here, there's some resources that can help you think through some of that. And if you are doing any work in this area, I would really, really love to talk with you about it. I think within the Python community, we are very uniquely positioned to think about this. We have folks that come from many disciplines, which I think is really, really cool, and I get really geeked out about. So yes, please, let's have this conversation is not a static one. It's going to be constantly changing, and I feel like my answer to this a lot is it depends, or it's complicated, but that's okay. That means we're actually leaning into the discomfort of knowing that this is a hard problem to solve. So if you do have any questions, please do reach out to me. I would love to continue chatting with you. Also, if you do like using imagery that reflects all types of folks in tech, and not just the standard one, there is a public image set that hashtag women of color in tech. You can use that. I think it's a pretty cool project. But yes, thank you so much. And I do have a bunch of Python and the PSF and PyLady stickers. I don't want to bring them back with me to Chicago, so find me and I'll give you some. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Lorena. Do you have any questions for our key speaker? No questions. So, one question.
So how realistic do you actually think it would be to have an FDA for algorithms in practical terms?
Well, so I think this is a conversation that's very hyper-localized. So I've actually been doing some work within the United States on this. Oh yeah, apologies. So the question is, how realistic would it be to have something like a clearinghouse for algorithms? And my response is, I think it is possible, but I think the correct model for that is to have a hyper-local model, at least to begin to start. Because, for example, as I was saying, the EU is kind of steps and leaps and bounds ahead of perhaps other spaces like the United States or other spaces. So I know within the United States that there's the former chief data scientist under President Obama, DJ Patel. I know that we actually have a consortium, so where there's a conference that we're kind of starting that's focusing and targeting this. And what we're trying to do is actually come up with an organization that will be associated with explicit policy goals that we want to bring about. So we're organizing on that front, and it's early days yet, because literally February of this year is when some of this work started. But I think it is likely, but I think the first iteration of that does need to be a hyper-local response. Any other questions? And again, oh yeah. Yeah, okay. So the question was, in regards to diversity and inclusion, are we actually able to say definitively that this data set is biased or not? Yes, it depends on the question that you want to ask, right? Which is kind of what that social media example was about. So depending kind of on your end goals, and I think that's one of the things that we as technologists can do is we need to be really transparent when we put tech into the world. Yeah, it might not be the best answer to say this is our intended use case, but at least it then holds us accountable to something. So being transparent about what is perhaps the intended use case for something, because someone's going to use a piece of tech in a way that we never imagined, and that's a little bit inevitable. So I think being transparent kind of around what your intended use of that was, and then also the research as related to fair, accountable, and transparent algorithms. There's some really interesting work happening with folks around learning fairness and what does it mean to have constraints that learn fairness. So I think that there's some work that's happening on the level of how do we translate mathematics into fairness. That is kind of promising, but then also I think us writing clear contracts up front and being able to hold ourselves accountable is another way that we can start doing some of this work as well. So what's it mean to be fair is contingent on the question you want to answer. And I also think we need to, as technologists, push back. And if we're writing something we know is hot garbage, we should be comfortable to say, I am not going to write this. I'm not going to use this data set because this is who I am as a technologist, and these are the values I stand for. So I think it's both. We need to be able to make a stand, but also we need to be transparent around the kind of work that we're putting into the world. And definitely, I think these are conversations we need to be having within our organizations. Anyone else? Cool. I think we're right at time. Sorry for the shortness of this, but if you have any questions, come find me in the hallway and I'll talk to you.